The cave had no visible chimney, no smoke curling above the ridge, no firelight bleeding through a doorway. From the outside, the opening in the rock looked abandoned, just a dark wound in the hillside, sealed by shadow and silence. But on the third day of the storm, when the temperature outside had dropped to 11 degrees Fahrenheit and the wind was stripping bark off the birch trees, something impossible was happening inside that rock. It was warm, not survivable warm, not huddle-and-pray warm. Warm, the kind of warmth that lets you sleep with your boots off, the kind that keeps water from freezing in a tin cup set on the floor. The neighbors had watched her carry load after load into that alcove in the days before the storm. Wool, split firewood, coils of metal tubing, flat stones stacked on a wooden sled. They had watched, and most of them had said nothing, because there was nothing polite to say about what she was doing. It looked like the work of someone who had run out of better ideas. One local account recalls a man shaking his head at the sight of her dragging a bundle of raw fleece into a cave mouth. "She's gone and made herself a sheep's den," he reportedly said. The words had a laugh. Winter arrived 6 days later. It did not arrive gently. What happened over the following 2 weeks would force every one of those neighbors to reconsider what they thought they knew about cold, about stone, about fire, and about the strange, quiet woman who had spent 4 days building something inside a hole in the earth that had no right to work as well as it did. The secret wasn't the wool. It wasn't the wood. It wasn't even the fire. It was the system and the fact that she had understood something about heat and stone and smoke that most people never think to ask. This is the story of what she built, how she built it, and why it kept her alive through one of the most brutal winters in living memory, while better-equipped shelters failed around her. If you've ever wondered whether ancient survival knowledge actually holds up against real cold, stick around. And if you're watching this from somewhere that gets serious winters, drop your location in the comments. I'd love to know where this is landing. Subscribe if you're new. There's a lot more of this kind of story coming. There is a particular kind of knowledge that does not come from books. It does not arrive in a classroom or through the careful study of printed diagrams. It moves between people the slow way, through seasons, through repetition, through the voice of someone older pointing at something in the sky or pressing a palm flat against the bark of a tree and saying, "Feel that." She had grown up with that kind of teaching. Her grandmother had been the one to show her, not in long lectures, but in small, specific moments scattered across years. The way certain birds moved before a hard freeze. The particular blue-gray color the western clouds turned when moisture was stacking up deep and serious. The way the soil near the creek stiffened earlier than usual in a year that would turn brutal. These are not superstitions. They were pattern recognition, the compressed survival data of generations encoded into gesture and habit. By the time she was managing her own property on the edge of the highland, she had accumulated decades of her own observations layered on top of everything her grandmother had given her. She kept a rough log, not a formal journal, but a collection of notes scratched into the back pages of a ledger, tracking first frost dates, snowfall timing, the behavior of the cattle in the weeks before serious cold. Oral accounts from neighbors who knew her describe a woman who was methodical in a way that could seem eccentric to those who did not understand what she was tracking. That autumn, several things converged at once. The summer had been shorter than usual and drier. The berry crop, which in her experience tended to run heavy before easy winters and light before hard ones, had been sparse and early. The birds had moved south in the second week of August, a full 3 weeks ahead of what she considered normal. The creek had dropped faster than rainfall alone could explain, which she associated, through years of observation, with a cold front building pressure from the northwest. None of these signs, taken alone, would have alarmed her. Together, they formed a pattern she had seen only once before in her life. And that winter, the one she was comparing this season to, had killed livestock across 3 neighboring properties and collapsed 2 outbuildings under snow load. She did not share this assessment widely. Local accounts suggest she mentioned it briefly to 1 or 2 people who received the information politely and moved on. There was no dramatic warning, no public declaration. She simply went quiet and started working. The first thing she did was walk the land near the cave she had used occasionally for storing equipment during wet months. She had always noted the particular alcove at its back, a narrowing of the rock that created a natural pocket, perhaps 14 feet deep and 8 feet across at its widest point, with a ceiling that arched low and close. In summer it was cool and still. She had wondered more than once what it would be like in serious cold. Now she was about to find out, but on her own terms. She spent the better part of a day inside the alcove with a candle, studying the airflow, pressing her hands against different sections of wall, noting where moisture gathered and where the rock stayed dry. She looked at the ceiling angle, the way the floor sloped almost imperceptibly toward the entrance, and the narrow throat of the opening that led back into the main cave. Then she walked out into the afternoon light and stood still for a long moment. She had made a decision. What she was about to build would not look like much from the outside. It would not impress anyone who passed by. But she had thought it through carefully, and she believed, based on everything her grandmother had taught her, and everything she had observed herself, that it would hold. The question was whether winter would arrive before she finished. Looking at the sky that evening, at the particular gray pressing down from the northwest, she suspected the margin would be closer than she would like. She went home and started loading the sled. Not all caves are created equal. This is a fact that most people never have reason to consider, because most people never need a cave for anything more urgent than shelter from a passing rainstorm. But for anyone who has spent serious time thinking about cold weather survival, the geometry of a natural rock enclosure matters enormously. The wrong cave can kill you faster than no cave at all. The danger is this: stone conducts heat. Not as aggressively as metal, but steadily, relentlessly, and in cold conditions, it conducts it in exactly the wrong direction, pulling warmth out of the air, out of your body, out of any fire you build. A large open cave with high ceilings and wide walls gives cold air enormous surface area to work with. The rock absorbs whatever heat you generate and radiates it back at the ambient outdoor temperature. You are, in effect, trying to heat the mountain. She understood this, which is why she had not chosen the main chamber of the cave. The alcove she selected had characteristics that made it fundamentally different from the broader space outside it. First, its size: 14 feet deep, 8 feet wide, ceiling between 5 and 6 feet at the highest point. This was a volume she could actually hope to heat and hold. Smaller enclosed spaces require exponentially less energy to bring up to a livable temperature. A room-sized space and an alcove-sized space are not just different in scale. They behave like entirely different thermal systems. Second, the ceiling geometry. The rock above the alcove curved inward in a shallow arch, following a natural fracture line in the granite. This curve was not dramatic, perhaps a foot of variation across the span, but it was significant. Warm air rises, and in a flat ceiling space, it accumulates at the top and gradually displaces downward only as more heat is added. In a curved ceiling, warm air tends to circulate rather than stratify, moving along the arch and returning toward the center of the space. It was a natural convection assist built into the rock itself. Third, and this was the detail that had caught her attention during her first exploratory visit, the floor of the alcove sloped very slightly upward from the entrance toward the back wall. Cold air is denser than warm air and flows downhill the way water does. In a space where the floor rises toward the sleeping area, cold air draining in from the entrance tends to pool near the threshold rather than flooding the entire floor. It was a small advantage, but in a system where every advantage compounds, small things accumulate into survival margins. She also noted the throat of the alcove, the narrow passage where it connected to the main cave behind it. This constriction acted as a natural baffle, slowing the exchange of air between the two spaces. The main cave, open to the outside, would remain cold. The alcove, separated from it by that narrow neck of rock, could potentially hold a different climate altogether. But potential was not the same as performance. The rock walls left bare would still conduct cold. The floor, even with its favorable slope, was still stone, a material with significant thermal mass that, if it started cold, would keep pulling heat from the space for hours before it began to give anything back. The ceiling geometry helped, but only if there was warm air to circulate. And any fire she built would generate smoke that, in an enclosed space, would make the shelter uninhabitable within minutes. Every one of these problems had a solution. She had been working through them in her mind for days. The alcove was not the answer. It was the foundation. What she was going to build inside it. The layers, the materials, the careful engineering of heat and smoke and airflow. That was the answer. She began with the walls. Oral accounts from a neighbor who helped her carry materials describe her standing inside the alcove with a measuring cord, marking intervals along the rock face. She was not guessing. She was planning load distribution, making sure the weight of what she intended to stack would bear evenly against the stone without risking collapse or shift. When she was satisfied, she sent him back for the first load of split firewood. The rock by itself was a problem, but she had known that from the beginning. What she did next turned that problem into a resource. The idea of stacking firewood against a wall is old. Settlers across northern latitudes had done it for centuries, partly for convenience, partly because a dense wall of stacked wood against an exterior surface adds meaningful resistance to wind and cold. The wood itself is not a great insulator by laboratory standards, but it is dramatically better than open air, and it fills space that cold would otherwise occupy freely. She knew this, but what she was doing went further than simple firewood storage. She stacked the split wood floor to ceiling along 3 walls of the alcove, the back wall and both sides, leaving only the entrance wall open. The pieces were stacked tight and flat, bark side out where possible, because bark carries a higher resistance to moisture than exposed heartwood. The stacks ran approximately 18 inches deep from the rock face, which meant that any cold conducting through the granite first had to pass through 18 inches of dense, dry, fibrous wood before it could reach the interior air of the shelter. 18 inches of stacked hardwood is not insulation in the modern sense. It does not approach the performance of fiberglass bats or spray foam. But it changes the thermal equation in a way that matters enormously in a survival context. It slows the conduction rate. It gives the heat source, the fire she would build, time to work before the cold can reclaim the space. In engineering terms, it increases the thermal lag of the wall assembly, the delay between a change in outside temperature and the corresponding change felt on the interior surface. In practical terms, it meant that a fire burning for 2 hours would hold the interior warm for 4 to 6 hours after the flames died, rather than losing the heat to the stone within 45 minutes. But the firewood layer was only the first part of the wall system. Over the stacked wood, she pressed wool. Raw fleece, or wool that has been minimally processed, has a property that makes it one of the most effective natural insulators available. Its fibers are crimped at a microscopic level, and those crimps create millions of tiny air pockets throughout the material. Still air is one of the best insulators known. It conducts heat at a rate far lower than any solid material. Wool does not insulate because the fiber itself is warm. It insulates because it traps air and holds it still. A 3-inch layer of compressed raw wool against a surface reduces convective heat loss significantly. She was not pressing it on in thin sheets. She was pushing it into the gaps between wood pieces, layering it across the face of the stacks, folding it over the top courses of wood where the wall met the low ceiling. Where she had enough material, the wool layer ran 4 to 5 inches thick. Contemporary accounts mention that she had gathered this wool over several seasons, storing it in a shed, more than she had ever needed for spinning, which some neighbors had found puzzling at the time. It was no longer puzzling. The combined wall system, stone, then 18 inches of stacked hardwood, then 4 to 5 inches of raw wool, created a layered barrier that addressed cold conduction, convective air movement, and moisture regulation simultaneously. The wool, critically, is also hygroscopic. It absorbs moisture from the air and releases it slowly, which helps regulate humidity inside the shelter. In a sealed stone space where breath and body heat generate moisture, uncontrolled humidity can make cold feel far more severe than the raw temperature suggests. The wool worked against that as well. The visual effect, when the walls were complete, was striking in its strangeness. The alcove had been transformed from a bare rock pocket into something that looked almost domestic. Walls of tightly stacked split faced with dense gray-white fleece. The ceiling of natural stone arching above. The entrance still open to the dimness of the main cave beyond. It was not beautiful, but it had the unmistakable quality of a space that had been thought about. One account from the neighbor who assisted with carrying materials describes standing in the finished alcove and noting that it already felt different from the cave outside. Quieter, somehow, and marginally warmer, even before any fire had been lit. He attributed it to imagination at the time. He would revise that assessment after the storm. The walls were done. The floor came next. And the floor, as she well understood, was where most shelter builders made their worst mistakes. Cold kills from the bottom up. This is something experienced winter survivors understand in their bones, sometimes literally. The ground beneath a shelter is not neutral. It is an active participant in the thermal equation, and in most improvised shelters, it is the single largest source of heat loss that goes unaddressed. A person can insulate walls perfectly, seal every draft, and burn a generous fire, and still lose dangerous amounts of body heat directly through an unprotected floor. Stone conducts cold upward with quiet persistence. Soil does the same. Even packed earth, which insulates better than rock, will drain warmth from a sleeping body over the course of a long night. She had thought about this problem carefully. The floor of the alcove was natural granite. The same stone as the walls, flat enough in most places, but uneven near the edges, with a few low ridges running diagonally across the surface, where ancient fractures had heaved the rocks slightly out of plane. It was cold to the touch, even in mild weather. In serious winter conditions, that stone floor would function like a slow drain, pulling warmth downward continuously. Her solution operated in two phases, and it was more deliberate than it might appear to a casual observer. The first phase was thermal charging. In the days before the storm arrived, while she still had access to an outdoor fire, she heated flat stones, pieces of dense, dry granite, and a few sections of dark slate she had collected from a nearby outcrop, in a sustained fire outside the cave entrance. She worked in batches, moving the heated stones inside on a flat wooden board and positioning them across the alcove floor in a specific pattern. Heaviest concentration toward the back wall, where she intended to sleep, and a secondary distribution toward the center, where the fire would eventually burn. Dense stone, once heated, releases that stored energy very slowly. This property, thermal mass, is the same principle behind the massive masonry stoves of Scandinavia and Russia that could heat a room for 12 to 18 hours on a single fire. The stones she laid into that floor were acting as a low-profile version of the same system. Each stone had absorbed heat energy during the outdoor firing, and that energy would radiate upward gently and continuously for hours inside the shelter, even before she lit her interior fire. Oral accounts suggest this process took the better part of 2 full days, heating stones, moving them, heating more. A neighbor who observed part of this process reportedly described her as moving rocks back and forth like a woman who had lost her purpose. The description captures the visible effort without any of the underlying logic. The second phase was surface layering. Over the heated stones, she laid cowhide, thick, stiff pieces she had cured herself over several seasons, cut to cover the sleeping area and the zone immediately around the fire position. Cowhide, dried and cured, is a poor conductor of heat. It does not absorb warmth from below and release it quickly the way stone does. Instead, it acts as a barrier, slowing the movement of heat in both directions. Against a warm stone floor, this means the heat releases more gradually into the air above, extending the duration of warmth rather than spiking it quickly and dissipating. Against a cold body lying on top of it, it means the stone's residual cold cannot transfer directly through to skin and clothing. Over the cowhide, in the sleeping area specifically, she added a layer of wool, folded fleece several inches thick, creating a pad that trapped air and provided direct insulation between the body and everything below. The combined floor assembly, heated stone, cured hide, wool pad, addressed the cold floor problem in 3 distinct ways at once: thermal charging, conductive resistance, and trapped air insulation. The result was a floor that was genuinely warm to the touch in the sleeping area by the time she finished. Not dramatically warm, not like a Hearthstone press close to a roaring fire, but measurably, noticeably warm. Warm in the way that a body, lying still through a long cold night, could feel the difference between slow heat loss and slow heat gain. That difference, sustained across 8 or 10 hours of sleep during a serious storm, is not a comfort detail. It is a survival margin. She knew this. She finished the floor, checked the position of the stones a final time, and turned her attention to the problem that had no traditional precedent in the alcove, the one element of her system that required the most unusual solution: the smoke. Fire solves one problem and creates another. Every person who has ever built a fire inside an enclosed space without adequate ventilation has experienced this in some form. The eyes begin to water, the throat tightens, the air turns gray and heavy, and the instinct to get outside becomes overwhelming. Smoke is not merely unpleasant. Carbon monoxide, one of its invisible components, is lethal at concentrations that can build quickly in a sealed space. A fire burning in an unventilated alcove would render the shelter uninhabitable within minutes. This was the central engineering challenge of everything she was building. The walls could be insulated, the floor could be warmed, but without a way to move combustion gases out of the enclosed space while keeping cold air from flooding back in, none of the rest of it would matter. She could not simply cut a hole in the rock ceiling. The granite above the alcove was solid and several feet thick. She could not run a conventional stovepipe through the wall because the wall was stone, and she could not leave the entrance open as a draft source without sacrificing most of the thermal benefit she was working to create. The solution she arrived at was the most technically demanding part of the entire construction, and the most surprising to anyone who saw it finished. She ran metal tubes through the cave, not through the rock itself, but along the ceiling of the main cave chamber outside the alcove, through the existing airspace of the larger cavern, following the natural slope of the ceiling upward toward a secondary opening she had identified near the top of the cave's rear wall. This opening was small, approximately the width of a hand spread flat, and it connected through a natural fissure to the hillside above. She had known about it for years. In summer, a faint draft moved through it, enough to flutter a candle flame held nearby. The tubing she used was salvaged iron pipe, sections of varying diameter that she had accumulated over years from a dismantled farmstead outbuilding, connected with wrapped linen joints sealed with a clay and ash mixture she rendered herself. The total run from the alcove fire position to the exterior fissure was approximately 22 feet, rising in a gradual slope of roughly 1 inch per foot, enough elevation change to create natural draft through the thermal buoyancy of rising hot gases. Draft in a chimney system is not mechanical. It is thermodynamic. Hot combustion gases are less dense than the surrounding air. They rise. If the path upward is clear and the outlet is at a higher elevation than the inlet, the rising gases create a pressure differential that draws fresh air in at the base, feeding the fire and pulling smoke continuously upward and out. The system she constructed used the cave's existing geometry as the chimney body, with the iron tubes simply guiding the gases along a path the cave would not naturally provide on its own. The installation required 2 full days of work inside the cave, much of it done lying on her back on the cold stone ceiling, pressing the clay joints into place with her hands. She tested the draft before sealing the final connections, holding a burning twist of dry grass at the fire position and watching the smoke move. It moved, slowly at first, then with gathering purpose as the tubes warmed and the thermal differential increased. But the smoke tubes were not only an exhaust system. This is the detail that elevates the construction from clever to genuinely sophisticated. As hot combustion gases travel through iron pipe, they transfer heat to the metal through direct conduction. Iron conducts heat extremely well, far better than stone or wood. A 22-foot run of iron pipe carrying gases at several hundred degrees Fahrenheit becomes, for the duration of the fire and for some time after it dies, a radiant heat source suspended across the ceiling of the alcove. The same pipe, that was removing smoke was simultaneously heating the air from above. Radiant heat from an elevated surface, ceiling level in a low-arch space, distributes differently than heat from a floor-level fire. It reaches the walls, the wool insulation, the stacked wood. It charges the thermal mass of the alcove from the top down, complementing the floor heat that was working from the bottom up. The two systems together, heated floor stones radiating upward, heated iron tubes radiating downward, created a thermal envelope that surrounded the interior air from multiple directions at once. She lit the first test fire the evening before the storm was forecast to arrive. The smoke moved cleanly through the tubes and out the fissure above. The iron warmed within 20 minutes and began to tick softly with thermal expansion, a sound she would later describe, according to one account, as the shelter settling in. The air inside the alcove, already warmer than the cave outside from 4 days of preparation, climbed noticeably within the first hour. She fed the fire for 2 hours. Then she lit dye to coals. She did not sleep that night. She sat and watched the temperature hold, pressing the back of her hand to the walls, to the floor stones, to the iron tubes as they cooled slowly from incandescent to warm to merely comfortable. Counting the hours. By the time gray light filtered through the cave entrance the next morning, she had her answer. The system worked, and the storm was 1 day away. It came from the northwest, as she had known it would. The first sign was the light, or rather, the absence of it. The sky on the morning of the storm's arrival did not darken gradually the way it does before a typical snowfall. It simply closed. The pale winter sun, already low on its arc, vanished behind a wall of cloud that moved with unusual speed across the highland, swallowing the ridgeline, and then the tree line, and then the field in front of the cave entrance in a matter of minutes. The wind, which had been light and variable through the night, shifted hard to the northwest and held there, steady, building, carrying a cold that was different in character from the cold of the preceding weeks. Denser, more purposeful. The temperature dropped 14 degrees in the first 3 hours. By midday, it had fallen to 9 degrees Fahrenheit. By late afternoon, with the wind driving snow horizontally across the open ground, conditions outside the cave had reached what old-timers in the region would later describe as the worst single day of weather in at least 30 years. Local oral record from the period suggests that by the second night of the storm, the temperature bottomed out near -4 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill values driving the felt temperature significantly lower. At the homesteads and cabins scattered across the highland, the storm made its demands immediately. With stoves needed constant feeding. The drafts that worked adequately in mild cold became insufficient against a wind that was actively pressurizing one side of every structure and depressurizing the other, disrupting chimney draw and forcing cold air through every gap in the chinking. Families that had laid in what they considered adequate firewood discovered, within the first 18 hours, that their calculations had been made for a different kind of winter. One oral account from the period describes a family burning furniture by the third day, not in desperation, but simply because the furniture was dry hardwood and the woodpile was running lower than expected. Log cabins of the period, even well-built ones, had a fundamental thermal weakness: the wall system. Standard round log construction with clay or moss chinking provides reasonable protection against moderate cold, but under sustained wind pressure with temperatures at or below zero, infiltration becomes significant. Cold air finds every joint, every settling crack, every gap where chinking has dried and shrunk. The interior temperature of a well-stocked cabin with a burning stove might hold at 45 degrees Fahrenheit to 55 degrees Fahrenheit on a night like that second night. Survivable, even manageable, but requiring the fire to run continuously and consume wood at a rate that exhausted most reserves within days. She had not lit a fire since the test burn the previous evening. Inside the alcove, the temperature when the storm arrived was sitting at approximately 48 degrees Fahrenheit, measured, according to the account of a neighbor who visited later and reconstructed the sequence, by the behavior of a small jar of water she had placed near the entrance to the alcove as a rough gauge. It had not frozen. It had not even formed ice crystals around the rim. She lit the fire at midday on the first day of the storm. The firewood she had stacked against the walls served a dual purpose now that its first purpose, insulation, had been established. The outermost courses of the stacks were accessible from the interior without disturbing the thermal barrier. She fed the fire steadily for 3 hours, keeping it moderate, not roaring, but consistent, the kind of burn that generates sustained heat rather than a spike followed by rapid cooling. The iron tubes above warmed again, ticking and creaking with expansion, then settling into the steady quiet of full thermal operation. At the 3-hour mark, she let the fire reduce to a deep bed of coals. Then she closed the alcove entrance with a heavy wool curtain she had suspended from a wooden rod wedged into a crack above the opening. A final layer, addressing the one gap in the thermal envelope she had not yet sealed. The curtain was not airtight. It was not meant to be. It needed to allow enough air exchange to feed the residual combustion of the coals and the draft through the iron tubes. But it reduced convective exchange between the alcove air and the cold cave air outside by enough to make a measurable difference. Inside the sealed alcove, with the curtain drawn and the coals breathing slowly and the iron tubes releasing their stored heat in long, patient waves, the temperature climbed. Not to comfort, not to the warmth of a well-heated modern room, but to the warmth of a living space in winter, somewhere between 54 degrees Fahrenheit and 62 degrees Fahrenheit, sustained, stable, and independent of the catastrophe unfolding outside the rock. She pulled her boots off. She ate a cold meal from provisions she had stored in the alcove earlier in the week. She checked the draft in the tubes, still moving, still clear. She added 2 pieces of wood to the coals at 9 o'clock that evening, watched them catch, and let the fire settle again. Then she lay down on the wool pad above the warm stone floor, pulled a heavy fleece over herself, and went to sleep. Outside, the temperature was -2 degrees Fahrenheit and falling. Inside, surrounded by 18 inches of stacked hardwood and 5 inches of raw wool and 22 feet of slowly cooling iron pipe, and the patient thermal memory of a floor full of heated stone, she slept through the worst night of the worst winter in a generation. Survival is not a feeling. It is a physics problem. And the physics of what happened inside that alcove during the worst 2 weeks of the winter can be described, not with laboratory precision, but with the kind of plausible, grounded estimation that emerges when you understand the materials involved and the principles governing them. Let us start with the walls. The combined assembly she had built, granite, 18 inches of stacked hardwood, 4 to 5 inches of compressed raw wool, created a barrier with a thermal resistance roughly equivalent to what modern builders would express as R 14 to R 18 in aggregate. That is a rough estimate, and it accounts for the imperfect stacking of the wood and the variable compression of the wool, but is not an unreasonable one. 18 inches of dense dry hardwood alone carries a thermal resistance in the range of R 20 by contemporary measurement standards, though in practice the irregularity of stack split would reduces that figure, since air gaps within the stack can either help or hurt depending on their size and orientation. The wool, even compressed, adds meaningful resistance on top of that. For context, a standard wood frame wall in a modern American home, insulated to code with fiberglass bats, typically achieves R 13 to R 21 depending on the stud depth and insulation type. Her wall system, built from split firewood and raw animal fiber inside a granite alcove in the days before a catastrophic storm, performed within the same general range. The floor system is harder to estimate precisely, but thermally it was arguably more important. The granite stones she had preheated outside, dense, dark, with significant thermal mass, stored energy in proportion to their weight, their specific heat capacity, and the temperature differential between their heated state and the ambient cave temperature. A conservative estimate, based on plausible stone density and reasonable firing temperatures, suggests that the combined floor assembly may have contained enough stored heat energy to release a modest but measurable warmth, perhaps 2 degrees Fahrenheit to 4 degrees Fahrenheit above ambient, for 6 to 10 hours after the last fire burned out. Not dramatic, but in a system where every element is conserving rather than wasting, that contribution matters. The iron tube system added a third layer to the thermal accounting. A 22-foot run of iron pipe, heated to somewhere between 300 degrees Fahrenheit and 500 degrees Fahrenheit during a 3-hour burn, carries significant thermal mass in the metal itself. Iron has a high specific heat relative to its weight, and the pipe, likely 1 to 2 inches in diameter based on the salvage materials available in the period, would have weighed somewhere between 15 and 25 pounds for the full run. That mass, heated and then slowly cooling, would have continued radiating warmth for 3 to 5 hours after the fire was reduced to coals. It was not a furnace, but suspended at ceiling level in a low-arch space. Even a modest radiant source makes a disproportionate difference to the perceived and actual temperature of the air below. Taken together, walls resisting conduction, floor charging from below, tubes radiating from above, while curtain reducing convective exchange at the entrance. The alcove functioned as a multi-layered thermal envelope rather than a single surface shelter. The practical result, reconstructed from the account of the neighbor who visited the alcove on the 4th day of the storm when a brief lull allowed movement outside, was this. With no fire burning and the coals cold, the interior temperature of the alcove was still measurably warmer than the main cave outside it. The neighbor, who had walked through conditions of approximately 7 degrees Fahrenheit outside, described the alcove interior as feeling like a root cellar in October, cool, but still, and carrying the residual warmth of a space that had recently been heated. A root cellar in October, by common experience, sits somewhere between 45 degrees Fahrenheit and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, at the moment of that visit, it was 7 degrees Fahrenheit. That is a differential of somewhere between 38 and 48 degrees, maintained passively with no active heat source in the 4th day of the worst storm in 30 years. To appreciate what that number means, consider the comparison. A standard log cabin of the period, with a fire burning continuously, might maintain 45 degrees Fahrenheit to 55 degrees Fahrenheit interior temperature during those same conditions, but only as long as the fire burned and the wood held. The moment the fire went out, the temperature inside a conventional log structure would begin dropping toward ambient within 60 to 90 minutes, converging with outside conditions over the course of a few hours. Her alcove, with no fire at all, was holding roughly the same temperature that those cabins could only maintain with a burning stove. The difference was not magic. It was mass. It was layers. It was the patient, compounding logic of a system designed not to generate heat dramatically, but to lose it as slowly as possible. She had not built a furnace. She had built a thermos. And for the next 10 days, while the storm pressed down on the highland and the firewood in every neighboring homestead burned lower and lower, she lit her fire for 2 to 3 hours each evening, let it reduce to coals, drew the wool curtain, and slept warm. It is one thing to describe what worked inside the alcove. It is another to understand what that meant, which requires looking at what was happening everywhere else. The winter of that decade struck the Highland community with a duration that compounded its severity. A single brutal cold snap, even a fierce one, can be endured. Families burn extra wood, sleep in their coats, keep the children near the stove, and wait. But this storm did not behave like a cold snap. It settled. It persisted. And in its persistence, it exposed every weakness in every structure that had seemed adequate under ordinary conditions. The first thing to go, in most households, was the margin. People had laid in firewood based on past winters. Reasonable planning, historically calibrated. But this winter was not a past winter. Within the first 5 days, families across the Highland were burning at rates they had not anticipated. The problem was not simply temperature. It was the wind. Sustained northwest wind creates a pressure differential across a structure that actively infiltrates cold air through every gap in the building envelope. Chinking that had sealed adequately in calm cold became porous under wind pressure. Door frames that fit snugly in mild conditions leaked along their edges when the building flexed under gusts. Every infiltration point meant heat loss that the stove had to replace continuously, driving consumption above what any calculation based on still air conditions would have predicted. Oral accounts from the period describe a rhythm of exhausting, uninterrupted labor. Someone had to be awake or nearly awake at all times, feeding the fire every 2 to 3 hours through the night to prevent the interior from dropping to dangerous levels. Children were kept in the room with the stove. Livestock that had seemed well sheltered in a barn were found, in several accounts, with frost damage to ears and extremities by the end of the first week. One account, preserved in a local historical record, describes a family whose cabin sat approximately a quarter-mile from a cave. Their woodpile, which had seemed generous in October, was reduced by 2/3 in the first 9 days of the storm. By the 11th day, the father was cutting green wood from living trees, wood that burns poorly and produces excessive smoke, to supplement what remained. The interior temperature of their cabin on the coldest nights, despite a fire burning continuously, reportedly dropped low enough that water in a bucket near the far wall froze overnight. This was not an isolated case. Several homesteads in the area reported similar patterns. Firewood consumed faster than anticipated, sleep disrupted by the need to tend fires, structures that felt adequate in normal winters revealing hidden inefficiencies under sustained extreme cold. The common denominator, in almost every case, was the same fundamental design limitation. The structures were single-layer systems. One wall of logs, one surface between the interior and the exterior cold. No matter how well that wall was built, it was fighting the entire force of the storm with a single line of defense. Contrast this with the layered system inside the alcove. A log wall of standard construction, 8 to 12 inches of round timber with clay chinking, provide the thermal resistance of roughly R8 to R12 under calm conditions, dropping under wind pressure as infiltration increases. Against sustained cold at -4 degrees Fahrenheit with significant wind, a wall at R10 is working very hard to do very little. The heat generated inside flows outward through that single layer steadily and without interruption. The stove must run to replace it. The wood must burn. The family must stay awake. The alcove had no single layer. It had granite, then hardwood, then wool, each layer slowing the outward movement of heat before it could reach the next. It had a floor that was giving heat rather than taking it. It had tubes that had already deposited their energy into the air before going cold. And it had a wool curtain that reduced convective loss at the one opening in the system. The cumulative effect was a structure that lost heat so slowly that a fire burning 2 to 3 hours per day could sustain a livable interior temperature indefinitely, even through conditions that were driving continuous all-night burns in the log cabins nearby. Her daily wood consumption during the storm was later estimated, based on the amount of wood remaining in her alcove stacks when the storm ended, at somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of what neighboring families were burning. Some accounts suggest even less. Whatever the precise figure, the neighbor who visited her on the 4th day of the storm and again after it broke described the difference in stark terms. She had wood left over. Most of her neighbors were calculating how many more days their remaining supply would hold. The storm did not kill anyone in the immediate community that winter, but it came close enough in several cases that the distinction between the outcome at the alcove and the outcomes in the surrounding cabins felt significant to everyone who lived through it. When the storm finally broke, when the wind dropped and the temperature climbed back above 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the first pale sunlight reached the highland in nearly 2 weeks, people began to move again, and more than a few of them walked toward the cave. The storm left the highland quiet. Snow lay deep on every surface, fence lines buried, wood piles reduced to white mounds, the creek running dark and fast beneath a crust of ice along its edges. The sky that emerged after 17 days of cloud was the particular sharp blue that appears only in the wake of a major winter system, as though the atmosphere had been scoured clean. The cold that followed the storm was still serious. Temperatures in the single digits through the following week, but it was still cold, without the wind. After what had come before, it felt almost mild. She emerged from the alcove on the morning after the storm broke. By several accounts, the neighbors who saw her in those first days after the storm described something that struck them as almost unsettling. She did not appear particularly diminished by the experience. She was not gaunt from cold-impaired sleep. She was not moving with the careful stiffness of someone whose core temperature had been stressed repeatedly over 2 weeks. She would remaining in her stacks. She had food. She had, by all appearances, come through 17 days of the worst winter in living memory in a hole in a hillside more intact than people who had spent the same period in proper cabins with proper stoves. The neighbors who came to look at what she had built did so with the particular quiet that accompanies the revision of a prior judgment. They stood inside the alcove and understood, looking at it, that they had missed something. Not because the materials were exotic, split firewood, raw wool, cured hide, salvaged iron pipe, flat stones from a creek bed, but because of the way those ordinary materials have been assembled and sequenced and layered into a system where each element reinforced the others. The wood insulated the stone and stored the heat. The wool sealed the wood and managed the moisture. The stones charged the floor and gave back warmth through the night. The iron pipe removed the smoke and added radiant heat in the same gesture. The wool curtain closed the envelope without sealing out the air the fire needed. Every piece was doing at least two things. Nothing was wasted. What they were looking at was not primitive survival improvisation. It was layered thermal engineering, executed with materials available in the region, based on principles that had no formal name in that era, but that physics would eventually describe with precision. Thermal mass, conductive resistance, radiant transfer, convective control. She had not used those words, but she had understood the concepts in the way that people who learn from the land rather than from textbooks sometimes understand things, not as abstractions, but as consequences, as things that happened when you paid attention long enough. The legacy of what she built did not spread immediately or dramatically. There was no publication, no formal documentation, no engineer who came to measure and record. But oral accounts suggest that in the years following that winter, several families in the area began making changes to their cold weather preparations, adding wool to wall gaps, preheating stones for floor placement before extended cold periods, thinking more carefully about the geometry of their shelters rather than simply the quantity of firewood they stacked. Small changes, the kind that do not make history but do, quietly, save lives. There is a modern parallel that is difficult to ignore. Contemporary building science has arrived, through decades of research and measurement, at conclusions that rhyme closely with what she built in that alcove by instinct and inherited knowledge. The principles of thermal envelope design, the importance of continuous insulation, the management of thermal bridging, the role of vapor control, the value of thermal mass as a buffer against temperature swings, are now foundational to high-performance construction. Buildings designed around these principles use dramatically less energy to maintain comfortable interior temperatures than conventional structures. They are more resilient to power outages, fuel shortages, and extreme weather events. The best of them, the ones that perform most impressively under stress, tend to share a characteristic. They are layered. Not one wall, but multiple lines of defense. Not one material doing one job, but several materials, each doing several jobs simultaneously, their effects compounding rather than simply adding. This is not a new idea. It is a very old one. What she understood, what her grandmother had understood, and her grandmother before that, and the generations of people who survived serious winters in serious places before modern heating infrastructure existed, was that warmth in a cold climate is not something you generate. It is something you protect. You build a system around it. You slow every path by which it tries to leave. You give it mass to live in and layers to hide behind and time to do its work. The fire is the smallest part of the equation. The thinking is the largest. She had done her thinking before the storm arrived. In the quiet days when the sky was still blue and the neighbors were watching her carry wool into a cave and shaking their heads. She had thought through the geometry of the alcove, the sequence of the layers, the routing of the smoke, the charging of the floor. She had tested the draft and counted the hours and made her adjustments before the cold made adjustments impossible. And when the storm came, she was ready. Not because she had more resources than anyone else. Not because she had access to materials or knowledge that were unavailable to her neighbors. But because she had asked the right question, not how much do I need to burn, but how slowly can I make this space lose heat, and then built her answer layer by layer in the days when there was still time to build. The warmth was not in the firewood. It was not in the wool. It was not in the iron tubes, or the heated stones, or the cured hide on the floor. The warmth was in the thinking. And the thinking had started long before the first snowflake fell.